was writing that code, I made the comment that tries to be smart. The problem that it runs into is that because you're setting the data source property consumes an object. Well, an object in general terms has no events. It has those methods that I showed you a moment ago. So there's no good way for the list box to know when the contents of the data source has changed. Now you would think, well, if you call refresh, obviously that should take care of it. It should be smart enough at least to know when I call refresh, it should recheck the data source and reprocess it. It's not. Well, okay, fine, but we're taking the data source and we're setting it equal to user data source again. So it should know that we've changed it. Well, in fact, it looks at that and says, lst user.data source, it already equals underscore user data source, because by reference they're the same thing. So it says they're the same. There's no need to reprocess the data source. So that's why, I'm not saying this is a good reason, but I'm explaining to you why it does what it does. That is why it doesn't redraw the list box, because it doesn't want to take the computing power to actually re-index or reiterate over that collection, that object that's there, and then redraw and rewrite what needs to go into the list box. So to fake it, we actually have to first say lst user.data source equals null, so that it doesn't equal the memory address of underscore user data source. Then you set it back again, so that it assumes that it's something new. And to be honest, I don't even know if the dot refresh is needed now. I'm going to go ahead and comment it out. If you're a keyboard person, to comment, hold down your control key and hit KC to comment, KU to uncomment. I'm not really sure why it's the K key, but it is, and that's how it works. That also works in SQL Management Studio, because they're both Visual Studio-based applications. So. There's also like a CE and a CU. I used to use those, but then I realized that SQL Management Studio doesn't support that. It supports the K command, K combo, so I now use the K combo. All right, so that's the trick. So we'll rebuild and run. So there's our user list. I'll come over, I'll hit the remove button, and boom, now it's gone. So we're now getting a visual representation. The reason I ended up getting that error was that it wasn't redrawing on the screen, but I kept hitting remove. Well, the next time I hit remove, it's going to error out. Give it a second. The error comes back and it says, gives me this unhandled exception, system.argument out of range exception. Additional information. The index was out of range. Must be a non-negative or less than the size of the collection. So one of two things happened. Either I'm trying to remove an item by passing in an index that's bigger than the number of items in the collection, or I'm passing in a negative number. So if I click into my code, actually let me hit the X here, close that out. I can mouse over index of user, because I'm in debug, because as long as you're running within Visual Studio, when an exception occurs, it'll lock and it'll put you in debug automatically. Index of user, when I called index of and passed in my selected user, it returned me -1. Because that user, which in this case is actually null as well, mouse up here, the selected user is also null. So there's no user. But even if there was, that user only exists in the list previously. It wasn't actually in our, or I'm sorry, it only existed in the list box. It wasn't actually in our list. So either way, it returns an index of -1, telling us that that user is not in the collection. So then by us saying, we'll remove the user at -1, it throws the exception, saying you can't remove the user at -1 because there is no position -1 in the collection. So to correct for that, we simply say if index of user is less than 0 or index of user is greater than underscore user data source dot count, return. As I look at it as quit doing what you're doing. So this line really should be moved down here. And this should be find user to remove from user data source. Now, if you're curious about how I move that comment up and down like that, you put your cursor on the line you want to move, you hold down the Alt key, and you use your arrow keys. I'm now giving you your money's worth for the course. All right. So I actually just learned that one last year. So.
That one always makes me excited.
You always have that case where you need to move the lines around. You gotta cut and paste. You can also cut a line by putting your cursor in there. You don't select anything. You just do Control X and it'll just cut it right out. And then you do Control V on that same line and it'll put it back. Or on another line, and it'll put it back. So again, if you're a keyboard person, those little tricks are nice. And I'm hoping you're not coding with your mouse. If you are, then well, that's something else. Okay, so we've now been able to exit the app, and we've now been able to remove an item and load our list box. So we've got 3 things done. So the last thing we need to do is actually add a user. So I'm going to go back to my form code. I'm going to go back up to my form load event handler, and I'm going to get rid of this. Actually, I will keep it there, and I will comment it out. I don't want to front load it. I want to be able to add user. So let's jump into our Solution Explorer. Don't need models. I'm going to right click on my project, do add form. Add Windows form. And I'm going to call this my add user form. Now that name will show up as the name of my class. It'll also show up as the title of my form. Now remember, the title is just a property. We can change that. Form, the class name, you can obviously change that as well. So if I go here, let me bring my properties dialog back for a moment. I'll just throw some spaces in here. All right, so on this form, toolbox out, I need 3 labels. 1, 2, 3, and 3 text boxes. 1, 2, 3. So this will be first name, last name, email. And then I'm going to take all of these. If you select all your controls, you can right click. Oh, they moved it out of there. Come up to your toolbar, and we'll do, I'm actually going to do align right because I want it to be furthest out. Oh, you SO. Okay. Drag and drop.
I wanted it to push them all to the right.
All right. Line them all up. And then I will add buttons. I have a submit button and a cancel button. So that will be called submit. It will be btn submit. This will be btn cancel. Go ahead and name these while I'm in there. If you notice the properties dialog, it keeps on the same property as I move between the controls. So I always try to pick, if I'm going to do all of the control names, I'll click name on the first one, type it in, and then as I click from control to control, I can just start typing, and it'll just put me right into that name property. So I don't have to keep going back to the properties box and clicking on the property again. So this will be txt first name, click, txt last name, txt email. And then let me jump back here to the title, or I'm sorry, the text, and this will be the cancel button. I'll put those guys in the middle. All right, so we have our form. So the first thing I want to do is jump back to my main form and wire up add user so that it'll present the form. So double click add user. Get rid of all these panels. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. Oh well. Now, from add user, I want it to actually show the add user form. Add user form is a class. So here I'll say I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to create a new instance of add user form. So add user form, just like my user class, it's a class. I can create a variable of it. My variable name will be add usr_frm equals new add user form. So I've now created an instance of the form. Creating that instance does not mean that it shows. I've just created an instance of that class. I now have it in a variable and I can do things with it. For the form to show, I have two method options to choose from, show and show dialog. Show shows the form. It's pretty, it's beautiful, yeah. By showing this form, the forms are technically, the term is mutually exclusive. They're independent of one another. I can jump back and forth. I can actually, I always catch myself on this. I can close this form. No, I closed the other one because it's dependent on the other. So there is still a dependency. But I could come in here and I could take this form. I could even minimize this if I wanted to, and now I just have this one, and I end up with this double window action going. So if that's what you want, just show the form. But I'd rather this form be locked and that I can't get back here until I do something with this. To do that, you say show dialog. So you're wanting to show the form as a dialog to the other form, which means that you have to act or interact with the dialog before you can get control back to the primary form. Looks the same. So I can't regain focus of this form until I do something with that. Now these buttons currently don't do anything. But the idea is once I do that, it also means, I should say this too, is that when this is called, nothing after that executes until that form is closed. So until we close the form, any code that I put past this doesn't happen. So let me show you. Messagebox.show shows a message box. Can't get back. And then there's my message box, which also shows as a dialog. You can't get out of that until you acknowledge it. If I do show, it showed the form and then it went on to the next line of code right away. So it showed my add user form, but then it also went on to the next line and actually brought up the message box. So this idea of is referred to as synchronous versus asynchronous processing. When it happens synchronously, show happens or show dialog happens, and then all the execution is locked. It stops running any more code until you close the form that is in a dialog. When you call show, it shows the form and then it goes on to the next line. It takes just enough time for it to draw the form on the screen, and then it goes on to the next thing. So I won't say one is better than the other, because depending on your use case and what you're wanting to accomplish, it may make sense that you can jump in and out of forms. It may make sense to do that when maybe you need to pull up a customer in one window and you need to work on placing their order in another one. So think about how your application will be used as to which case you want to deal with. Show dialog is the simpler case. Show is a slightly more complex case. We're going to go through the more complex one. So from our add user form, we want to wire up the cancel. The cancel is actually pretty easy. It's this dot close. Close the form. We're not exiting the application. We're just closing the form. Okay. Submit. It's a little bit more work. Step 1. Verify all fields are filled. Capture field values into a new user object. Raise the submit event. Close form. So those are the 4 steps we're going to go through. To verify the fields, obviously depending on the type of control you're using, depends on the type of action or steps you'll take. In this case with the text box, if string is a type, but it is also a class. The class can have what are called static methods. All classes can have static methods. The static method I'm going to use is null or white space. So if txt firstname.text is null or white space, no value. Message box.show first name is required. Return, break out of the function, go back to the form. And then I'm going to copy and paste that line 2 more times. Txt last name, txt email. Last name is required, email is required. So just a real quick simple validation. Okay. I could do a regular expression validation, make sure that the email address is an email address. I'm not going to spend 15 minutes trying to write a regular expression to validate an email address. If you've ever written regular expressions, you know what I'm talking about. All right. So I validate. So now I'm going to say user. Now remember, we're in a new class, therefore our using statement does not exist. So it's balking, saying that it doesn't know what user is. So if you want to access those accelerators without using a mouse, control period brings up your accelerators. So I always default to control period, enter, and that'll just put my using statement at the top. So user, new user equals new user, right? Variable name is new user. Now again, I can go new user dot first name equals txt first name dot text, and go through and do all of that over and over and over again. Or I can use that inline initializer, and I back out user dot, so it's just first name equals txt first name dot text, last name equals txt last name dot text, comma, email equals txt email dot text. Semicolon at the end, and there's my user object. Raise the event. That's where the fun happens. I'm going to skip that. This dot close. Close the form. Okay? Any questions up to that point? Yes?
Would we have to refresh the list box?
We will, but you can't talk to the list box from this form.
Okay, so we have to do it.
Yes. So that brings us to the point of, we now have a user object. How do we get that user from here back to there being the main form? And then once we get the user over there, we have to add it to the user data source, and then we have to refresh the list box. Because right now, this user isn't in the user data source. It's not even in the context of our main form. It just lives as a variable inside of add user form. There's no communication. If I go back over to this code here, if I say new user, it's looking at me like, what are you talking about? It doesn't even know what new user is because it doesn't exist over here. So what I propose we do, and generally it's just good practice, why I propose we do it, is that we create an event that the add new user or add user form raises, just like when a button is clicked, the click event is raised, and we handle that event. We create a new user submit event when we click that submit button. That the main form, because really if you think about it, our forms are just controls. So when our add user form raises an event, the main form should listen for that event and handle it and say, oh, there was a new user added to that form. I should capture it and do something with it. Does that make sense? All right. So we're going to go layer by layer. So in order to do that, this form has to raise the event and say, hey, a new user was added, the submit button was clicked, it has to be able to tell that to something, and something then has to listen to it. So, events are like properties, generally speaking. To define an event, you do public event, and then you have two pieces. You have event handler, and then you have the event name. Going to F12 on event handler first. Zoom in. An event handler is a special type called a delegate. When we talked about user classes, we talked about how you create an instance of a class, you say new user. What happens is that a section of memory is carved out, and what's returned to your variable is a memory address, right? It's a reference. And then when you assign from one variable to the next, you're actually doing it by reference. You're passing that memory address around. So if A equals B and they're both of the same type, then that same memory address lives in A and B. Delegates are memory references or variables for functions. So when you write a function, that code gets compiled and it actually gets carved out into memory, and that function is set into memory. Just like your variables. All the variables that are declared inside of that function, all the work that happens in that function, they're all commands. They all get loaded into memory. That's how the computer executes them, is because they live in memory. That function lives at a memory address. That memory address can be stored in a variable and then be called somewhere else. What's unique about these is that these delegates have to have a specific signature in order for you to take a function and store it inside of the delegate. In this case, your event handler, that's your type. Just like user, event handler is a type. So you can declare a variable of type event handler. I'm going to do it here just because it's empty. This isn't correct. I just want you to see it visually. Public event handler, my handler. That's a variable. This type is the delegate. In order for you to put a function in here, the function has to match the signature of the delegate. So the return type in this case has to be void. So whatever function that you create that you store inside of your event handler variable has to return void and has to accept two arguments, an object and an event args type. Well, event args is another class that comes out of the .NET framework. It's actually under the system namespace, so it's at the root of the framework. So if you write a function that returns void and takes these two parameters, you can store it inside of an event handler variable. Kind of cool, right? And then you can take that event handler variable and pass it into another function, and then that function can call that function based on its variable name. So follow that concept, and let's say that we create an event called new user submit. Well, we could write a function, an event handler, and store it inside of the new user submit variable. I know I'm getting a little abstract, so let's try to make this concrete. So there's my new user submit event. It's a delegate, it's a variable. I can say that this equals, and actually with event you do plus equals because you can have multiple event handlers, multiple functions pointing to the same event. Now Visual Studio is smart. It goes, oh, well, every time you do a plus equals next to an event, you're probably going to want to create a delegate that you can pass to this event. So tab, it creates a name based on the name of the variable and the name of the event. Tab again, and it'll actually create that event handler. And if you look at it, the signature is the same. Void is the return type, and then it takes in an object and event args. It's just a function. It's nothing fancy or mystical about it. It's just a function, a method. But this method is just like any other type. It's just like an integer or a string. It can be stored inside of a variable. It's stored inside of new user submit. Yes?
So when you hit the tab, it created the method down there.
Correct. So by calling that event and then doing plus equals, it hit tab once and it just gave me this name. Auto-generated the name. Hit tab a second time and it'll generate the method. Now, if we look inside of event args, event args inherits from object. So the only methods that we get, the only options we get are equals, get hashcode, get type, and toString. It doesn't do anything for us, yeah.
Since we overrode toString and get hashcode,
Yep.
would those be overrode here as well?
For the event args,
Yeah.
no. Because event args is a different class. context of our user class. So when you do an override, you're not modifying the code that you're inheriting. You're only modifying, you're doing like a replacement. That's what an override does. So in the context of our user, we're replacing two strings that we inherited with this thing that we wrote. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it only replaces it in that class.
Correct. Yeah. You'd actually have to, basically you couldn't. You'd have to go through like an inheritance chain and change it all the way at the bottom. So you're just changing it for your class. So since event args doesn't have anything to hook onto, we need a way to transfer our user as an event argument. That's the argument we're passing. We're passing in that user. So we have to create our own event args. So if we come back to the solution, models, right click, add class, we're going to create a new event args for our user. So we'll call it our user event args without the uppercase R. And we'll make this public. And we're going to go ahead and inherit event args. You technically don't have to. You're not required to inherit event args, but it's a best practice. It has to do with convention following and some other factors. If you're really interested, you can look it up. But it's best practice to inherit, so that way it can be interchangeable and workable. And most importantly, you'll see why in a moment, we're going to use it in what's called a generic. And that generic requires that your event args inherit from the base class. All right. So in here, I want to simply add a property. So this is just another class. I'm just going to add a property. Public user, new user. And I'm going to do a get with a private set. And I'm going to add a constructor, CTOR, double tab. And I'm going to say this dot new user equals new user. No. Lowercase n. And then I'm going to add an argument here of user, new user. Now, do you catch the subtlety here? The casing is important. User, little n, new user, is this guy. He's getting passed in as the constructor parameter. This dot new user is this property, so I'm taking this value that gets passed in and I'm storing it inside of my property. My property is read-only. Is that a big deal that it's read-only or not read-only? Generally speaking, no, but again, best practice says that your arguments should be read-only. You shouldn't be modifying them because that same event arg object could be passed to multiple events, so you want to make it immutable. Yes?
Can you use user because it's in the same namespace?
Yes. Because this class lives in week 4 models, that's why I could do it without having to do a using statement. So I've now created my custom event args. I'm going to get rid of this method because it's not going to match the signature I want in about a minute. I'm going to delete that, and I'll just back all that out for now. So I'm going back to my add user form. My event was of type event handler, but I want to use my custom event args. So to do that, there's also another type of event handler that is a generic. And we talked a little bit about generics before. I'll probably actually cover it in more detail. But the idea is that you can strongly type. You can custom type this class. So like our list, we say that our list is a collection of users because we put it in the angle brackets. So we can only put users in there. This says your event handler will take this specific type or return this specific type of event arguments. Prior to having generics, you would have to go through it and create your own custom delegate that matched your custom event arguments. And you'd have to go through all that whole process. Now, with this event handler type, we can just simply pass in our event args that we want to use. And that's it. So we're now using our custom event arguments for a user. We're still wiring up an event handler. And that will be for our new user submit event. So if I come back to the main form, I'm inside my add user click. I create the form, and then before I show the form, I'm going to wire up to this event. Oh, come on now. There we go. So Visual Studio is doing this for me. It's looking at my delegate, my event. It's looking at that event handler, and it's saying, oh, it returns void, takes an object, and takes user event args. All right, we'll come back to this in a moment. Now that we have our event in the add user form, let's raise that event. Now, because you're doing the plus equals process when you wire up or listen to an event, you can have cases where an event has no listeners. So the first thing you have to do is say, does this event have listeners? Is it set to something is another way to think about it. So if this dot new user submit does not equal null, because just as you can plus equals to an event handler, you can also minus equals and remove that listener. So if new user submit has a listener, we want to then raise the event. Now remember, new user submit is nothing more than a delegate, and a delegate is a variable for a function. So just as if we were calling add user form, new user submit, let's just say that we're calling that, we type add user form underscore new user submit, parenthesis, we pass in a sender and we pass in the event args. That's what you do when you call a function, right? Here we say this dot new user submit, parenthesis, and we pass in the event args. So think of it kind of as a dispatch process. You call one function, you call that event, and anything that's wired up to listen to that event indirectly gets called. So in this case, we have one event handler wired up to the event. So by calling this delegate, it will call that function for us, because we did the plus equals. If we wanted to wire up two events, we could plus equal two different functions into this, and they'll both get called. We could wire up 10 functions to all listen to this. And we make one line call, but all of them get dispatched and all of them get called. Now there's no guarantee in what order they get called, but they will all get called. Sometimes it happens in parallel, sometimes it happens sequentially. And if you're interested, I'll do that at the end. So, the object sender is typically the class or object that is raising the event. In this case, it's our add user form, so simply you just put this. Comma, we have new user event args, or user event args. So we don't have that instantiated, so I'm going to go ahead and say new user event args. I'm going to do that inline initialization again. I take that back. I'm not doing the inline initialization because it's read-only. Calling the constructor, it takes our user object. So here I'll pass in new user. That's it. So calling this, I'm passing in this form, right? This form class, add user form. And then I'm passing in new user event args, passing in our new user that we instantiated in the step prior. I know this is a lot of back and forth. I'm hoping that it's making some sense. Okay. Once you kind of grasp the concept, it's usually easier just to kind of work all the way through this and then work all the way through that, but I'm trying to get you to understand how the pieces interact with one another. So, we call new user submit. That call calls this function. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove this exception. And I'm just going to say obj, I'm going to say no. I'll say user to be added equals E dot new user. I'm gonna put a breakpoint right there. I'm gonna go ahead and run this. And actually, I'm gonna go ahead and put some more breakpoints in here. I'll put a breakpoint here, 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 and here. So this is within the add new form submit. So we'll go back to the form, hit add new user. Form pops up. Add new user dot show shows the form. Hit submit. Using the step over, it's going to verify that we have values in each box. It's then going to take those values and create a new user object. So if we mouse over new user, we'll see in here that we have our 3 values added the text boxes. We then are checking to say, is new user submit not equal to null? Is there a value? If you mouse over new user submit, now I know it's hard to see, but it says in here, it says method equals void add user form underscore new user submit, which is the function from the main form. Step over, step over. It's now going to call this function. So now I'm going to actually step into this delegate and watch what happens. First, it instantiates the event args. So remember, it works from the inside out. So it's going to do this line of new user event args, new user first. So if we mouse over new user, this is the Kevin Gantos object that we created. Step over, it's going to do that line, stores it in the property. We can now step out, and then we're going to step in again, and we're going to step into the event handler on the main form. In here, we have our event args, E, and E dot new user is the Kevin Gantos object from the other form. This line just stores it in a variable. We haven't executed this line, so this variable is null. Our object only lives here. If I step over this line, it's now in the context of this event handler. So the one step we have to do now is we need to add it to our user data source and then call the refresh on the form. What's it called? User to be added. Okay. So add new user. Submit. Then if I select Steve and hit remove, so I select John, hit remove. There we go. What questions do you have?
have it hard coded?
You would have to you'd have to write it to a text file, write it to a database. You have to store it outside of the application, because once you close the app, it's no longer persistent in memory. Every memory address you've allocated, that space that holds that list gets destroyed essentially. So yeah, you would have to take it, and we could do a lot of things. You could take it because it's only 3 values. You could output them as a CSV, comma separated values, first name, last name, email. So first name, comma, last name, comma, email. Each one of those on its own line, and then you just write it out, read it in. There's a process. There's processes within the .NET framework for doing what's called serialization, where you take objects from memory and you serialize them or write them to file. You can serialize things as XML, and there's auto serializers, or you can roll your own. There is JSON serializers, so you can take your object and write it to a text file as JSON, and then read it back in as objects. And then there is a binary serializer. And basically what it does is it literally takes the bytes from memory and takes those bytes and writes them to a file. The first two, or even the CSV, is a preferred method of serializing an object. If you're going to write it to a file, the last object of doing the straight byte writes to a file and then reading them back again is not recommended. Because from version to version of the .NET framework, there's no guarantee that the implementation is the same. So therefore, you could write it to one file, upgrade your .NET, and then you'd never be able to read them back. Yeah.
Why do you not recommend the JSON file?
No, I would recommend the JSON. I'm talking about the binary serialization. Yes. So JSON, XML, or basically roll your own are the preferred. Just don't use the binary serializer. So. Any other questions? Anything I can clarify or go over again? Alright. This is usually one of the heavier nights because all of the heavy stuff happens at the end of the lecture in terms of events and event arguments and event handlers and delegates and all of that. So make sure that you go back and watch the videos if you have any questions about it, if things seem a little wishy-washy. The homework assignment for tonight will basically be that. I want you to go back and replicate this. I want you to practice it, creating event handlers, event args, events, getting data to move from one form to the other, because this will be a fundamental piece for your final project. This is typically what hangs a lot of people up, is getting that data to move from form to form. So this is a piece I want to make sure that everyone has a good understanding of. Okay? Last call, questions? About this project, any of the above? Okay, have a good week.